the U.S. has two great power threats that are becoming more and more of true adversaries to us in a way that we haven't seen in some time, and that's China and Russia. And I don't know a single veteran who fought who was like, oh yeah, we believed that the ANA could be there for years after the U.S. pulled out. I think we all knew that the moment that Americans withdrew, that the entire nation would collapse. And so when you look at China, they're really kind of the pacing challenge. They've been neck and neck with us, both in terms of military technology development, but also the strength of their economy for some time. Americans are vulnerable to being scammed or being hacked. These are things that we need to have an actual deterrence for a foreign policy position on, because those impact you regardless if you're an American in Texas or Colorado or you're an American living overseas. If you don't have competition, you're totally single-threaded with one, if it's only Boeing, if you have one or two options to build a jet or to build a submarine, then you really can't hold people's feet to the fire.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Evan Munsing again. As those of you who might have watched our YouTube channel before might know, might remember, he is running for Congress in Colorado. He is a former Marine. He has been a business consultant. He's a man of many parts, a sportsman, a thinker, and indeed a friend of Fair Observer. And today we are going to discuss something supremely important, and we are going to put his feet to the fire, even though he's a friend, and perhaps especially because he's a friend. He's going to talk about peace through strength, how the US deals with China, Russia, and new threats. Welcome, Evan.
Thanks, Atul. Great to be here, and thank you for having me back.
Well, pleasure. Evan, it is a very important time in American history. You could say, you could use the words of the former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who said, we are at a Zeitenwende, basically a new age or a turning point of the age. And you are running for Congress, and those people who will be fortunate enough to be elected to the Congress will have to decide on matters of national security. And I would kick off our conversation with a simple question. What is the core national security problem America faces right now?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this last time, but I really think it's this idea that there's an emergence of great power competition, and that the U.S. has two great power threats that are becoming more and more of true adversaries to us in a way that we haven't seen in some time, and that's China and Russia. And so this great power competition, to me, is very concerning. And that's kind of one end of the spectrum. I think on the other end of the spectrum, you also have the emergence of cheap new threats that are both credible and quite powerful. And so when you look at China, they're really kind of the pacing challenge. They've been neck and neck with us, both in terms of military technology development, but also the strength of their economy for some time. And then, of course, you have, which has shown itself to be a disruptor to the world order. Its attacks in Ukraine obviously come to mind. I think there's also some changes here in the sense that the threats are really multi-domain. So it's obviously conventional where you're seeing increasing use of cyber as an offensive capability, economic coercion, information warfare. And so this isn't just traditional military threats. It's also people are willing to play in many different roles. You see that in China with their Assault Typhoon. You see Russia and their willingness to sponsor disinformation attacks across the world. I think there's also a lot of risk right now with what's happening to the availability of technology and how cheap it is to everyone across the spectrum down to lone wolves. And so I think about stuff like drones, which have been used very heavily in the Ukraine. You can obviously get them off the shelf on Amazon, as well as things like AI, which are becoming incredibly powerful and scale super easily. And so what happens is we move into a world in which a single lone wolf can have access to new technologies that could allow them to take down an aircraft or to commit some incredibly disastrous hack or a direct cyber attack on U.S. infrastructure. And so I think the test for the American national security apparatus going forward is, how do we deter aggression? How do we keep the homeland safe while also maintaining strong economic growth and strong alliances across the globe?
All right, so the core security problem really is great power competition plus new cheap threats, and these are multi-domain. And this is the case both with state actors and with non-state actors. Would that be a fair summary?
I think so. I wish I could boil it down to one single thing, but it's really tough to distill everything into just one thread.
Well, let's talk about China and Russia. You've mentioned we are living in an era of great power competition, and China and Russia have become increasingly adversarial. Or you could say, some would say the US has also become increasingly adversarial. That's the allegation from the Chinese and Russians. But importantly, from your perspective, and you are a former military man, what does engagement with China and Russia look like in the coming years?
Yeah, I think they're different, right? I think both of those countries, I think it's very easy to just kind of put them in a bucket and say they're adversarial nations, but I think they behave very differently, and it's important to address them as separate threats and separate paths forward. I see China as a nation that wants to reclaim some of its past history, but is very kind of territorially bound. They're obviously very closely intertwined with the global economy. And I think for them, there's a path forward that looks like having credible deterrence in places like Taiwan and the Philippines to make sure that they don't try to expand their territory by taking over Taiwan, by building up islands in the South Sea, which we've seen them do, shutting down maritime trade. But I think there's also a path forward in which we help them reintegrate back into the global economy in a way that is fair and sustainable, and which doesn't take advantage of American businesses. And I think they have a very different view of what they can gain from the world order than does Russia. I think, if you were to, it's very hard to understand exactly what goes on in Mr. Putin's head at any one time, but he's clearly much more willing to roll the dice to do direct aggressive action against other countries, be it Chechnya or Georgia or Ukraine. And I think
to be fair, Evan, Russians would argue that Chechnya is a part of their country. So to say that, to say that other countries, I think you may want to use examples like Georgia and Ukraine.
Well, Putin has also said that Ukraine is part of Russia. So I think what he says and what the international law says may be two different things, at least in some of those issues. But be that as it may, Putin clearly is very willing to resort quickly to direct action, to violence, to invasion to achieve his ends. And so I think the answer there is going to look something much more close to traditional deterrence and containment of Russia. And that has to be through NATO stepping up to the plate, to really rebuilding its military capabilities, to investing much more into building a strong, credible threat against Russia and actually being a bulwark of defense. And obviously we want the U.S. to be part of that journey.
Would you say Europe has stepped up to the plate? They have promised to increase GDP spending from 2% to 5%. of the budget over a period of years, of course. They are going to issue common debt for Ukraine. That is what has been in the news. They didn't seize Russian assets yet, but they've frozen them indefinitely. Yeah. So would you say that the Europeans are stepping up now?
I mean, I think the jury's still out on that. And again, when you talk about the Europe, you're talking about, 27 different countries. Some countries like Poland have clearly stepped up to the plate, really be spending, improved manpower. They're buying a lot more heavy equipment. But I don't think that's necessarily true of all the other nations in Europe. And so I do think there are some dichotomies at play in between who's really viewing Russia as a real threat and willing to invest behind it. Whereas obviously countries that are further away from Russia, I think, view that as a little bit less critical to them. So I think they're starting to move in the right direction. I don't see Western Europe really taking Russia as an existential threat the way that certainly Poland views it, and that really I view it as a threat to Europe.
All right. We will get to that later if we have time. We'll talk about existential threats later. You served in Afghanistan. You were a Marine. How does that experience inform you when it comes to national security, when it comes to military intelligence, when it comes to even accountability?
Yeah. So, the quick background here is for your listeners. I was a Marine infantry officer, did a couple deployments, first platoon commander, and then as an advisor to the Afghan military. And I think the common thread that unites a lot of veterans of both Iraq and Afghanistan is the sense that, we were all obviously willing to fight. America was willing to go into those wars. But we have learned that we really need to have war tied to direct, tangible goals for the country. Mm-hmm. And we should be very leery of any kind of sense of overseas adventurism that is leading us down a path of getting into an armed conflict. And I think specifically right now about Venezuela, where there's a lot of these kind of precursors of Iraq that are being mimicked in Venezuela with the labeling of fentanyl as a WMD. Look, if you're going to send men and women into combat, you should be damn well sure that it is for things that are truly critical to these. I think another thing that became very apparent in those long wars is that sometimes institutions will believe themselves and believe their own kind of biases. And we saw this with the retreat out of Afghanistan, where there were some very terrible and extremely optimistic views of how long the Afghan army could survive after the U.S. military pulled out. And I don't know a single veteran who fought who was like, oh yeah, we believed that the ANA could be there for years after the U.S. pulled out. I think we all knew that the moment that Americans withdrew, that the entire nation would collapse. And so something that the country really needs to work on is defeat those institutional biases. Like I would love to see red teaming, which means that anytime you have an assessment that there's someone poking holes in it, and that is just par for the course. Really forcing accountability, I think important. People should be held accountable for their decisions, for their predictions as well. And that really never happened with the draw out of Afghanistan. And those forecasts are important, right? Like intelligence forecasts, intelligence analysis informs a lot of what goes on in the real world. And so not holding people accountable to me is ridiculous.
Yeah. Question for you. And I say this because I take an interest in intelligence. Part of what we do is analogous to intelligence because we are also analyzing trends. We are predicting and we are looking at history. We are looking at data points. Do you think, America, with its 17 intelligence agencies, needs another bout of reform, and serious reform, because the comments one gets from CIA officers, as well as naval intelligence officers, as well as intelligence officers from other agencies, is that the thickening of processes has really affected intelligence. Also, it is harder now to recruit top talent, as it compared to, say, the 1960s, when you'd have some of the superstars from Harvard and Yale. And yes, there was a little bit of elitism, and we know about skulls and bones and all of that jazz, but some of these oldies are truly impressive. And now it is harder to A, get talent, and then B, move beyond ossified processes into sharper thinking and indeed action. So do you think, given these criticisms from professionals, Congress needs to act for another bout of reform and rationalization?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, the Director of National Intelligence was supposed to be sort of a position that helped to create interagency coordination across all the different intelligence services and create a true whole of government solution. That's clearly not happened, and I don't think the current system really works. You've probably spent, I would imagine, far more time talking to these people than I have. Certainly, as a infantry officer, I wasn't sitting in on CIA briefings. But I'm
a free radical. I can float around. I'm unconstrained by hierarchy as an entrepreneur.
I think there's a lot to be done there. It's probably something I should spend some more research doing. I'm not sure exactly what the solution is. We know that there's a ton of overlap between intelligence agencies. Yeah. We know that there's both healthy but unhealthy competition as well. And certainly the outcomes we're getting as a nation don't seem to be what we'd want. I mean, there have been so many surprises that you would think that a really effective, massively budgeted intelligence system of 17 different agencies would be able to foresee. And that's everything from the failure of the national Afghan national army defend itself adequately, all the way up to Russia's attacks in Ukraine that weren't really foreseen more than a few days out. And so there's clearly opportunity there. I'm not exactly sure what should be done, but I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts.
All right. Well, happy to share what I think and what I know, and all of that at a later stage. Let us move on from military intelligence and accountability, which you care about and talk about, to foreign policy. Foreign policy can seem very distant, especially during times of economic pain, especially when there is a massive cost of living crisis affecting Americans. How do you make the case to your voters in Colorado who are far away from another country, north, south, east, west, that foreign policy matters?
Yeah, I bring it back to national security, right? Foreign policy directly impacts national security. The way we present ourselves as a nation in the world, the way we act in the world, ultimately all of that comes home to us. And there are very concrete examples of that. So cybersecurity is a great, very tangible example that a lot of people actually deal with on a day-to-day basis. So we know that China is a bad actor in this realm. So I think you and I briefly talked earlier about the Salt Typhoon attacks, which is this state-sponsored program of the Chinese government to conduct espionage and hacks and theft of intellectual property from Americans, as well as sponsoring what are called pig slaughtering farms. So basically, these call centers that are effectively scamming American individuals. That is something that Americans deal with, right? Like, information gets exposed on the dark web all the time. Americans are vulnerable to being scammed or being hacked. These are things that we need to have an actual deterrence for a foreign policy position on, because those impact you regardless if you're an American in Texas or Colorado or an American living overseas. Another example would be, organized crime, particularly as it relates to drugs. So everybody at this point, I think, is very well aware of the opioid crisis, and particularly fentanyl, that's killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. That is something that has very clear foreign policy implications, because those drugs have to enter the U.S. from somewhere, and they enter the U.S. typically from our southern borders and from our sea borders, or either through Mexico or through the coasts. And if we actually want to solve that problem, it will have to involve us working with other nations, as well as with having real credible border security. Another example would be, this is a little bit more thinking outside the box, but thinking about some of the threats that we're probably going to be exposed to in the future. Like we talked about a little bit earlier, drones are super cheap. We've seen Russia and Ukraine use swarm attacks of drones as a very effective way to attack each other. There is a real threat, and we've seen this in the American news, of drones being used in the United States to attack airports. There was that whole series of drone sightings, I think, over New Jersey airports that shut down air traffic for a while. And so all of these are real things that we have to be prepared to deal with as a nation. They all have foreign policy and national security implications.
So you've talked about cybersecurity, and that's become a buzzword, particularly in Washington, D.C. What is it that the U.S. could be doing and should be doing that it isn't doing today?
Yeah, I mean, as an observer from outside the system, it doesn't really feel like we're doing much. I mean, every few months you hear about some massive new attack. Often these things are state sponsored. They directly impact everything from our infrastructure, from our grid, all the way to money that gets stolen, to companies that have to pay ransomware attacks. And I just see this as a little bit analogous to white collar crime, where because it's not a direct physical assault on someone, I think that people often kind of dismiss it institutionally as like, oh, it's not really a big deal. But at the end of the day, if money's being stolen from you from a Ponzi scheme or from an hacker in the Philippines or in China, that's a real impact on your life. And so I think there's a whole host of issues that as a country we need to be. The first is, I think we absolutely need to have like real credible cyber deterrence, which means an ability not only to protect our country, but also to use cyber in an offensive capability if we think that other people are using cyber attacks against us. I think another thing is to start shifting.
So do you mean hack the Chinese and the Russians, hack Vladimir Putin's phone?
Absolutely. I mean, if they're us, then we should be hacking them. And I'm sure some of that goes on. And optimistically, one could say that maybe it's just so effectively done that nobody knows about it. But given how leaky Washington is, I kind of doubt it. It sounds more like we don't actually have a credible cyber deterrence position. And given that like there's this decades-long history of these things happening, it doesn't seem to me like we really have either one, good cyber defenses, and number two, good cyber offensive capabilities. Happy to be proven wrong, but I haven't seen anything that does prove that wrong. I think another critical thing as we go into a world in which AI becomes more and more prevalent is how do we shift some of the burden from end users, so from individual citizens, from people who are logging into Facebook or their bank account or whatever, onto the companies themselves. so that it's now secure by design. The companies are really thinking about what happens when a system gets attacked, or when user data gets stolen, or when passwords get exposed, and starting to make this more as like setting a standard that all companies have to follow. I think that's probably similar also to how we need to treat our critical infrastructure, right? Things need to be secure by design. We also need to be bringing a lot of the manufacturing of our critical infrastructure onshore. A lot of like electrical transformers are still built in China, right? Because it's cheaper. They also have like a whole ecosystem around that. But we also increasingly have found out that some of those transformers are compromised. They're being sent to us with kill switches or backdoors that are embedded in the hardware in order to allow people to hack them. And obviously that should be incredibly concerning to Americans that a foreign nation is manufacturing things, sending them to us, we're consuming them, and it might give them an edge over us or let them take down an entire grid. That is very problematic. And so those are things that need to be secure by design, but also that we should be building onshore in America, both because it's for our national security, but it also creates great jobs here.
I mean, you talk about reshoring and nearshoring a lot, and you say this will help create good-paying American jobs, and you say this is a national security issue as well. This is a win-win as far as you're concerned. My question to you is really, can you do that? Can you even do that? We've discussed issues of cost. We've discussed issues of capital. We've discussed issues of regulation. Over to you. Walk us through your reshoring and nearshoring vision.
Yeah, so I think we absolutely can do it. Let me start with an example. So during COVID, there were a number of very significant gaps exposed in the U.S. supply chains. One of them was PPE. So the nitrile gloves that doctors use, face masks, just none of that stuff is manufactured in the U.S. anymore. And suddenly we were in a world in which doctors didn't have access to basic protective equipment that would keep them and keep their staff safe. And that's obviously like a huge risk. If doctors start getting sick, they can't care for patients. Patients then get sick, and doctors are now the patients. The baby formula incident was also like incredibly disruptive. I have a niece who, thankfully has grown out of it now. But when she was on baby formula, she had to have some very specific hypoallergenic baby formula that became instantly impossible to find. And so like the entire extended family and friend network was recruited to try to find baby formula all across the U.S. and then ship it to this poor kid who was sick. And so those are real threats to American security, to American lives that we absolutely should be thinking about and investing in to make sure that they don't happen again. Right? You don't know when the next global pandemic is going to happen, but I think we can probably acknowledge that there's going to be another one, and there's going to be one after that, and it's only going to happen more and more as we go forward. And certainly in a world in which biological weapons exist, this is something we all should be very concerned about. So I think that's kind of one tangible example. Another tangible example is more on the job creation side, which is right now the U.S. Navy has a huge problem getting skilled welders. U.S. Navy can recruit and train people. It's much harder to recruit a skilled welder who can show up at a job site and help build a ship.
You can find sailors, but not welders. That's an open secret.
Yeah. And these are really two sides of the same coin. Like, we know that our supply chain is vulnerable. Mm-hmm. We know that we don't have the right trades and the right skills in our current workforce. And both of these things can kind of dovetail into both in a world in which create a more secure America, but also more jobs. Things are part of the same question, which is back these manufacturing capabilities to the U.S. and also how we train people to actually do that work. there are a couple of things I think are really important. One is we need to be willing as a country to invest in the long term. I was talking with a friend of mine who does a ton of work in this space, and he gave me the example of a factory in North Carolina that there had been a limited bipartisan bill to invest in this factory to manufacture gloves and face masks in during COVID. All right, so we recognize the problem, which is that all this PPE is made overseas. So let's invest in American manufacturing. But it was like a 2-year contract, and once that money disappeared, the factory was no longer viable, and so it shut down. And now you have a bunch of workers who have been displaced, who are unemployed. Plus, we've just lost this capability. And something that I think Congress is terrible at is long-term planning and committing to spending money in the right places over multiple years into decades. And things like this really need long-term investment, because you have to give a company time to set up a factory, time to recruit workers, to move workers in. And then you want to give private investors the sense that America is actually committed to bringing this capability back so that they can take on the burden of investing and training and doing all of that and actually build up a solid manufacturing base. The same is true with jobs programs, right? We want good apprenticeship programs in the US. That has to start with government dollars going into welding, into training welders. And then that creates the incentives for private companies to invest rather in further job training and continue to build that out. And so I think there are some obvious choke points we need to be concerned about. One is medical. So PPE, pharma, all of that stuff. We want to make sure that we're able to have good manufacturing in the US for things that keep people safe and help them get better. We're increasingly seeing this with choke points in our sort of advanced manufacturing supply chain. And that's everything from rare earths to the batteries that go into your Tesla or the car you drive. Even if it's not an electrical car, it involves a lot of these rare earth magnets. To things like rocket motors. A lot of our rocket motors are actually manufactured overseas, which is obviously problematic. And so there is this need to bring those choke points into the US where we can control them, remove them as potential threats, and then build up the manufacturing capability to go along with that. But that only works if we can commit as a nation to spending money over years so that people can then get behind it and the jobs can actually materialize and we can solve these problems.
So you've talked about spending money over the long term. So when it comes to spending money, let's talk about defense procurement, where Congress does spend money and does spend a lot of money, my dear sir.
Yeah.
And and I know a lot of that money is wasted. So how do you, just your proposals will bring back manufacturing and reshore and nearshore and all of that. And of course, the template that we have is defense industry or defense procurement. How do you bring efficiency to these new programs you're suggesting? And what do we do about the existing white elephants that DoD seems to be building in America, and the model of very wasteful big conglomerates having factories in every congressman's constituency, practicing a form of crude Keynesianism to get everything through approval in Congress?
Yeah. Well, speaking as someone who carried a lot of stuff on my back in Afghanistan and across the globe, right? I think most people who've served are fully cognizant of the fact that what we get as soldiers, as Marines, as airmen is often out of date. It's expensive and it doesn't work the way it should. And if you're an infantry guy, it's way too fucking heavy. And so all of that is a big problem. And I don't think anyone has any illusions that defense spending is super efficient, or at least they shouldn't have, because it's really not. I talked to a lot of people in kind of space and defense tech startups because Colorado has like big hub for that. And something I've heard a lot is no one should have to fight the government so hard so that we can then fight the enemy. And that really just gets to the heart of this, which is if you're not one of the primes and you're trying to innovate, you're trying to do capabilities to play, it is really hard and very frustrating to get through an extraordinarily hidebound defense procurement process. And there are a few things I think about that. One is it's a very slow process. There's a ton of red tape. Oftentimes the red tape is there for good reason, like it's intended to prevent corruption, it's intended to have high standards, but over time it just gets to the point where you actually can't get anything done. And so it's self-defeating. The other thing is that it's very focused around optimizing for the last war, because that's what people feel comfortable designing around. And certainly in these big, prime defense contractor conglomerates where the workforce tends to be, very institutionalized to DC. And so that's why we have weapon systems like be it an aircraft or a tank or a submarine that is 50 years old and really hasn't been updated. In some cases, it's because it's super effective. Like I think about the Ma Deuce, the 50 caliber machine gun. Great weapon system. And it hasn't been changed or hasn't really been changed in almost 100 years. Effective. But
the Browning machine gun is also pretty good.
Yeah. But that is an exception.
I've got a 50
yeah. All right.
I've got a 50 caliber pen.
I've seen those more as bottle openers.
Yeah. I mean, they probably want me to use my pen like a bullet.
War of words.
The pen is mightier than a sword. Well, it should be if you're using a bullet as a pen.
Where was I? Oh, so I think I think there are a couple things that need to be done. One is I think there is a need for us to actually really change the way defense procurement works. Number one, to re-regulate it to make it so that it is faster and more innovative, and that there are more small contracts that can be won by defense startups. But also probably more importantly, so that research and development is broken into true research and then into development. The way it happens right now is the government works with the prime subcontractors to do both the research and the development. And so those people already have an in the process. And so if you're doing hypersonic research for rockets or for jets, the prime contractors are already involved in the pure research side of it. And so they have an entree point to win these massive defense contracts that are being surfaced. Whereas if you break it apart, you let more people compete for the research, more people compete for the development, more people compete for the manufacturing, then you're creating a more competitive space, more ideas are entering, and there's an opportunity to do things faster at lower cost. I think there's also a huge issue with accountability. A lot of these research programs and development programs exist for decades upon decades, and no one's actually held responsible for achieving a specific outcome. And so some of these rocket programs, and again, I'll go back to hypersonic flight because I just happened to have a conversation with a Marine Corps buddy of mine earlier today about this, where those programs have been in place for 30 years. They've not actually resulted in a weapon system that's in use, but the same people have been there the entire time. And so there is a problem there with accountability, which is billions of dollars being spent. There's no outcome. And yet those people continue to be in charge of this whole show. And that's obviously very problematic. I think
there have been so many instances of waste, particularly in shipbuilding.
Shipbuilding.
We could sit here till tomorrow going through the expensive failures that we've seen.
Yeah, shipbuilding, come on, again, lots of Marine buddies who end up in the Department of Defense in different areas. One of one of my friends gave me the example of a submarine program that he was very familiar with. And this is a pretty classic example, which is, the submarine is, 12 months or 18 months past delivery. The PEO, the procurement officer who's in charge of the program, calls up the prime and says, "Hey, you haven't delivered this. We're 18 months past due. You've gone way over budget. I need this delivered, in the next 6 months, or I'm going to have to find someone else to do the work." And then the prime, the contractor, goes up and calls the local senator and says, "Hey, this PEO is threatening my company. You need to have them back off because that's your constituency." And then the senator calls the PO, and suddenly this all gets swept under the rug. And so there's no real accountability for a lot of these contractors. And so that's why you end up with deliveries of things that are way out of date, that don't really work, and are way too expensive. And no one ever gets held accountable for that. Like, there are investigations, but those same prime contractors are still there and making lots of money. They're never penalized for delivering things too late or too expensively. And that just comes down to, like, as a country, are we willing to, and do we have a government that's willing to actually hold people accountable, be they government employees or be they defense contractors? And that, to me, is a huge problem. And you can't achieve efficiency if you can't hold people accountable.
So, Evan, you do realize you are talking about holding the military-industrial complex accountable, which is a tall ask.
Yeah, it is.
It's easier said than done. It's a big project. It'll require a new political consensus and new public pressure to get what you envision over the line.
Yeah, and like a lot of things kind of dovetail, right? If you don't have competition, you're totally single-threaded with one, if it's only Boeing, if you have one or two options to build a jet or to build a submarine, then you really can't hold people's feet to the fire, because it's like, well, who else are you going to go to? And so creating more competition will let us hold people accountable, and we should be holding their feet to the fire. And if people aren't doing their job, those contracts should be going to someone else so that they can execute on it, they can accomplish it. I mean, that's how capitalism is supposed to work.
Yeah, you're sounding like Tim Wu, the Columbia professor who wrote the book The Curse of Bigness, and who has talked incessantly about competition policy, better competition policy in the US, and talked about the need to break the big boys up and to ensure that every industry, particularly ones that see oligopolistic practices, open up for competition, which is something Teddy Roosevelt did a century ago, the previous century. So we've talked a bit about a number of issues. Let's go back to something we dropped, right? And we talked a bit about dealing with China and Russia, and you talked a bit about NATO, and I said if we had time we'll go back to. So China has more skin in the game in the global economy, and you suggested that with China you can have more of a carrot and stick policy, because China needs to sell stuff to the US and elsewhere. With Russia, you suggested more of a stick policy, and you said that we have to strengthen NATO. What should NATO look like in the next decade, and what new policy should the US come up with? As of now, some would argue, and Donald Trump's supporters argue, that by getting the Europeans to cough up more money, America is very well on the right track. So what do you suggest different?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is part of it. Like, Europeans should be paying for European defense. America should be an ally, but Europe needs to take a leadership role, both from a building up the manpower, building up the equipment, but also certainly from a defense and budgetary expenditure perspective. And obviously, as you said, they have done that, and we need to continue to see them do that and to invest, to build, to recruit. And at the end of the day, they benefit from all those capabilities themselves. It shouldn't be America, as it was for a while, to keep Europe safe. Europe is more than capable of doing that work itself. They're rich nations. They have lots of people. We shouldn't expect that America is bearing the brunt of all those costs. I think Ukraine's like a really good example of where European defense down, because Europe has not had a credible deterrent capability for quite some time, right? Obviously, it has nuclear weapons, but from a conventional warfare perspective, they've really kind of fallen behind.
Yeah.
So
just to interject, it's France and UK that have nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Poland might build them soon, but as of now, it's France and UK. And UK is in NATO, but not in the EU after 2016 Brexit.
Yep.
And the French nuclear deterrent probably acts as some insurance for all European countries, but the reality is that Americans guarantee European security, and that is something that has led to resentment in Europe itself, as well as America here.
Yeah, and so I think that comes down to Europe needs to take more of a leadership position in building up that credible defense. And I think what we've seen is
by credible defense, you mean capability outputs, air defense, logistics, ammunition, cyber, the whole shebang.
Yeah, all of that, and also just a willingness to show that they will field armies if they need to. I think Putin read the room very, very well when he attacked Ukraine, which was he saw that Europe did not have any kind of deterrence, and the U.S. wasn't willing to step into that vacuum entirely alone, and kind of got into this position where Europe is starting to reinvest in its military. It's starting to build up some of those capabilities. More of European budgets are going to the armed forces. All of that's good. We as Americans need to encourage them to continue to do that. We obviously want interoperability between their armed forces and ours, between their equipment and ours. But that burden really should be carried by European nations because it is in their best interest.
So we've covered a lot of ground, and we've spoken about NATO. Let's talk about your swing seat, your swing district.
Yeah.
Why should your swing district care about all that we've been talking about? I mean, it's just the two of us studied in the UK. The two of us have traveled a wee bit, have been to different countries. How does that matter to the plumber, Joe the plumber in your district?
Well, there are a lot of veterans in my district, so a lot of people are, here do really care about these issues. I think the broader question is a little bit less, why should Americans care about foreign policy or national security? I think people inherently get that we need to have a strong country and be safe. I think it's a little bit more of, well, I'm worried about my next paycheck or paying my mortgage or whether or not my kids are safe in school. As a Coloradan, what do I get out of this conversation? And to me, that comes back to the infamous phrase, it is the economy, stupid, which is that all of
James Carville,
the Raging Cajun. All of these things come back to opportunities for us to strengthen our economy. All these things, be it talking about building up, cyber deterrence means high-paying software jobs. Reshoring manufacturing means bringing back really strong, good-paying jobs to the U.S. To here in Colorado, we have a huge space economy. A lot of defense tech startups here. All of these things create better jobs. They mean that we have fewer vulnerabilities. They mean that in the next pandemic, we'll be able to get baby formula and proper protective equipment. It means when war comes, we will be at less risk. We'll be able to strengthen our nation while we also have good jobs, safe hospitals, safe schools, safe kids. And I do think at the end of the day, foreign policy is local, and everybody benefits from having a coherent, long-term American foreign policy that acknowledges what the risks are, but also finds a way for us to partner with our allies and build stronger relationships going forward. And it also means that fewer of our taxpayer dollars go overseas, either to pay for other people's security when they can pay for it themselves, or to get serial nations like China that are then going to turn around and weaponize some of that against us.
All right, let's imagine you get elected next November. We are recording this in December. In fact, on 26th December, December 26, 2025, a day after Christmas. So let's say you do get elected. What would you prioritize in your first 100 days in Congress?
Yeah, so I'm very passionate about cybersecurity, and it is just a huge bugbear for me that we don't really seem to have a strong cyber posture or real credible cyber threats. And so to me, like secure by design standards and having secure critical infrastructure is absolutely huge. I think a second component to that is, and it's sort of part A and part B of this, is an industrial surge to bring back manufacturing for critical infrastructure to the US, and to have a long-term investment plan for that. And so we're talking about decades, not years, of investment into US manufacturing for things like the electrical grid, for munitions, for hospital protective gear, for pharmaceuticals, all of that stuff. Like, we need to be investing in our country and committing to long-term spending in order to make sure we build up that security in the US, bring those jobs, and encourage private spending to take over in the future. And then the third thing is I'm an efficiency maniac, and I think there's just so much opportunity in defense procurement to make it more effective, to make it more efficient, to get things done faster and at lower cost, that ultimately will keep the nation safer, benefit our warfighters, and also benefit the U.S. taxpayer at the end of the day. So
Brilliant.
Those are my 3 priorities.
Brilliant. Evan Munsing, thank you for your time. We will be back for yet another conversation. It's always good to talk to people running for Congress to see what they are thinking. And hopefully once, if and when you get elected, you'll deliver on some of the many things you clearly care about. All the best. Happy holidays to you. Happy New Year. And we'll speak again soon.
Thanks, Atul. Speak again soon.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.